Welcome back, everyone. Quite a swift turnaround. Next speaker is Flo Bohl. We're delighted to welcome him to UX Bristol. He's currently a product manager at Bloomberg, where he spent 15 years or more as a UX designer before he transitioned into product management. He spent most of his career in advertising and design agencies. And today, he's going to have to get his title right. He's going to be talking about how to present design work to non-designers. So thanks very much, and over to you, Flo.
Thank you. So once this curious little boy asked me what I did when I was still a UX consultant. What do you actually do? That's the inevitable question when a UX designer gets asked after the original explanation draws only blank stares, right? So it's always a really good exercise to explain something to a 6-year-old. So my explanation was asking questions whilst people use computers or phones. And this is one out of a million of answers of what UX is. And we know this is a very difficult topic and there's no real consensus in the community. However, as Ben in this talk just earlier has perfectly laid out, asking questions is really one of the core competencies of people in UX, whether they're researchers or designers. But this talk will be about the exact opposite. This will be about talking. So whilst being good at asking questions is really important in user experience, the more senior someone in user experience becomes, the more relevant and important the aspect of talking becomes, especially people outside the UX domain, people who perhaps don't have so much understanding of what you do and how the processes work. So as a product manager in a large organization who previously worked in small design firms as a user experience designer, I have learned the hard way how to present designs to get stakeholders on board. I failed many times. I've also obviously succeeded sometimes. And this is how to avoid the missteps I've took to get the designs approved. Now sitting at the receiving end, I confirm what does and doesn't work. Unlike me, most people working in product or marketing don't really have a design background and have very little understanding of the design process and lack the imagination to see the potential of work in progress. So here are 6 useful steps that really help me, at least, in the conversation with designers to better understand what's going on. And this has helped me to get designs approved in the past. In preparation for anything, it's always good to start with knowing your audience. Now, starting a presentation, I find it useful when a designer first summarizes the brief, shares the insights, shows the design, and then before jumping into gathering feedback, states the intent of that design. So knowing your audience, that's a really important one. This is Jeff Patton, actually, product management guru, but he actually talks mostly about user experience. And he always says, give customers what they want, right? But it's the same thing when we have a presentation. Before I start my presentation, I always ask myself, would I be listening to myself? Would I give myself 5 minutes of my time or even more? What's in it for me? And asking myself that question makes it much clearer in what it is I'm trying to achieve. So I aim at making my presentation relevant to whoever I'm talking to. For example, presenting to clients in marketing, you will have to use different terminology as if I'm presenting to developers. For example, talking about how previous design has increased reach might only impress marketing managers. So I often prepare my presentation by talking to individuals in a team that I haven't met yet. So before presenting to them, I get a picture of what resonates and what they're interested in, right? So never assume knowledge. When you talk to the people, someone might understand what semi-structured research means. Some people maybe as an engineer, haven't really participated in some semi-structured research, or in laddering interviews, or whatever it is you're trying to get to. So when you can't really access the people that you're trying to talk to, maybe there is a salesperson or someone in account management who's previously met these people, who can give you a picture of how they take and what resonates with them. So now, beginning the presentation, it always be good to start recapping why you've done the work before you actually show it. Right? So even very senior designers in the past presented to me by starting with showing the design, and often don't. So often I personally don't fully understand the context of every meeting I had in the past, and so I'm always appreciative when someone is mindful of reminding me and then everyone else in the room of the context of what you're looking at. So no good story typically begins with the climax, right? So you don't start your presentation with showing the design, but you're building towards that. So maybe the context of the conversation or the meeting is only a small iteration within a screen, and you can then confidently put some of the concerns aside before they're even mentioned. The copy is not part of the conversation. The image choice is not part of the conversation. So this already sets aside some of the feedback you may get later. Summarize how you've interpreted the brief. I think that's a really important one, because sometimes the brief is badly worded or even non-existent, right? So when I was still a designer in a small design agency, I've been given the brief from hell. A project manager came to my desk with a printout, put it in front of me and said, "Can you make this look more better?" Yeah. And so in this case, I would have summarized the brief in my own words and say, okay, so what you're trying to achieve here is to improve the creative positioning, the task, in the context, the cultural context of the target audience. Yeah, that's the context. To increase the brand appeal, the goal, right? So it's very similar to what product owners do to write a user story. And so at this point, the project manager could say, well, actually, you're quite wrong here, but at least you've given them a framework to provide you a better brief next time, or they can correct you, and then you have an input that helps you to deliver an output and eventually an outcome. So I'd really like to ask you, what do you consider a good brief? So you can scan this QR code on the top left here on the screen with your phone and open the website to submit your response, or you go to slido.com and enter the number 667909, and we can see a word cloud appearing here. So I'd be really interested if you get briefs, if you're writing a brief, what is a good brief for you? Clear goals. That's a really good response. But what is a clear goal? Maybe a good brief has a certain framework, or it can be completely free of a framework. It always depends on the context. Sometimes you don't need a brief because you know that person so well that you're working with, but then that's probably a little bit outside the context of a presentation, as I'm talking about here, where you're actually perhaps talking to people that you typically don't know when you're selling a design, or when you're looking at a bigger presentation for a bigger piece of work. Being specific, that's really good. Problem focused, okay. Maybe the part of the design should also be to discover the problem. But yeah, if there's already a problem existing, then that should be certainly part of the brief. Being concise, yeah, that's a really big one, it seems. It should be written, problem and not a solution. Yeah, I totally agree. Plain English, defined constraint, well circulated. Who is it for? What's in scope? That's right. That's really important as well. And typically that's what product owners also have to look after. What is in scope and what's out of scope. Who is it for? Absolutely, totally agree. So let's move on now. Thank you for your responses. So before you show your work, continue with summarizing your research and outline some of the findings. If it's competitive design research, for instance, or inspiration you took from elsewhere, build up to the big reveal of your work by outlining how the work started. In the best case, user research informed every step of the way, or even data that you found from analytics. And in the worst case, it was just thrown together overnight. And for the latter case, right, you can just still show relevant work from your past to prove your expertise. So now it's time to show the design. But like in this case here, which is a drawing from Foster's and Architects of an office building, don't just talk about the obvious, but tell a story, right? You could say, well, this is a drawing of a building and there is a staircase in the middle, and you can use the staircase to move from one floor to another. But architects typically focus on the key benefits of a building for showing their work. This is how Foster Architects describe the office I'm working in. Bloomberg's European headquarters is respectful of its location in the City of London, close to the Bank of England, St. Paul's Cathedral, and the Church of St. Stephen, Waldorf. In its form, massing, and materials, the new building is uniquely of their place and time, a natural extension of the city that will endure and improve the surrounding public realm. It's a true exemplar of sustainable development with a BREEAM Outstanding rating and the highest design stage ever achieved by a major office development. So you can clearly see that there is a lot of information about the context in which this design will be sitting in, or is sitting right now because this building is finished. So I think the aspect is also about building suspense in the presentation. And how do you do that? I think the story accompanying the story and the accompanying visuals should go from vague towards concrete, right? From sketch towards detail, from wireframe towards design. And when presenting work, create an emotional appeal and go beyond just facts, but describe the vision, like Foster as an architect did by saying, it will endure and improve the surrounding public realm, right? So Foster could have stated these interesting facts about the building instead. They could have said, the building cost 1.3 billion from start to finish, has fiber optic cables that could span from London to Geneva, uses more steel than the Eiffel Tower, and had the biggest single concrete pour in the history of the UK. Now, this presentation, despite containing really impressive numbers, it doesn't really illustrate why the building would be a good investment or why anyone would like to work in it, right? So if you talk about numbers, perhaps they give a reason or a better understanding of the decisions that went into some of the design elements. You say, 20 users responded positively to this and only 3 to that. That gives a good context, but otherwise I would be light on numbers. Now at this point, stakeholders would love to share their feedback and say, I hate it, I love it, or this is absolutely awful, it's the worst thing we've ever seen. But let the work sink in first by asking them to wait until you've finished stating the design intent. And that's really aiming at framing the feedback that follows thereafter. Right, so every project typically, normally, follows a goal. In a marketing campaign, it might be to raise awareness of the unique product benefits or to impact direct sales. In a news organization, you may be looking at improving the interface to aim at increasing engagement or get more reads. But talk about how the work will reach the goal, right? So when the goals aren't set, outline the success metrics that could help stakeholders measure your work objectively, like these very popular metrics. But these are just a few out of a ton of metrics that could be used to measure the success of design. but intent should not be one-dimensional. In my view, as a product manager, it's incredibly difficult to measure success purely on one dimension. And it's something that as a product manager, I spend a lot of time thinking about. What is a good metric? How can we measure whether this is a good investment? Whether we should invest a lot of resource in this project or not. Even negative verbal feedback can be a success metric when the goal of the design is to gain user insights to iterate on the next version of the design. So I'm always careful not to put too much emphasis on one metric alone. It's good to follow data-based objective decision-making. However, data sometimes just doesn't tell us everything, and we need to keep asking ourselves, what are we missing? Always. I find it incredibly difficult to assess the success of a design very confidently based on a single variable. You can't really have just one variable that's responsible for the success or failure of a design. So I'd like to know from you, who provides the metrics in the organization you're working in typically. Again, you can scan this QR code here on the top left or use the number 667-909 to submit your responses on slido.com. So maybe I'm missing something here, but is it typically the user experience team? Maybe that's you. Is the product owner providing the metrics to measure success? Is it the client? They just say, we want to achieve 5% conversion rate up from 3 right now in our emails. Please give us a design that achieves that, or do you not normally use metrics to measure the success of your design? And I think metrics, when I talk about metrics, I mean really the quantitative aspect, not necessarily qualitative feedback, which is much more difficult to measure. It's a good indication of why things are happening, but yeah, this is a really important one, the data aspect. So yeah, what data metrics do you put in place? Well, and who provides those? So it's interesting, a combination of people, as I was thinking, but it's also interesting that UX is fairly low. I would have really, in my organization, I really like it if a UX person comes to me and says, well, I think this is a really good metric you should be using in order to assess the success of a design or even of a product. I find it super helpful if people in user experience help me here. Yeah, thanks for your responses. So now the stakeholders had time to reflect and were given a chance to view the design more objectively by listening to the work's intent. You've framed the following conversation that's now happening about whether or not the design will achieve the stated intent. And this will be more helpful feedback rather than just gut reactions like, I don't like it. So gathering feedback, I always find incredibly useful by grouping them into 3 categories. One is keep. Keep means it's likely, the design is likely to meet the intent or the goals that are set. Improve, which means that it's unlikely to meet those goals. Or parking lot. Typically, a lot of stuff comes up where people say, well, there's a typing error. You think, yeah, thank you. Okay, that's I'll write that down, but it's not really part of the discussion. Or we have a completely new idea. How about we have flying cats? And, whatever crazy stuff is. You don't want to dismiss it. You want to write it down. You want to be proactive and include it in the conversation, but put it clearly visible to stakeholders into the parking lot section. And this will then help you to summarize the feedback to outline the next steps. So based on your feedback, we have these areas of improvements. And we also really want to focus on the stuff that we have done well here in this first iteration. And we can now go to users, test it, and see whether there is something else that we have found that hasn't come up in this meeting yet. So this is a really clear path to next steps in a presentation. So next time a little boy comes to you and asks you a really difficult question, and yes, you've guessed right, this little boy is my son. You would respond to a question like, what's the best presentation? Maybe with a little story. And I found this story super interesting. It's a story from a book called The Perfect Pitch, which I read when I was still working in advertising. It's written by a guy called John Steele, advertising planner. And I think the story is now fairly popular and well known. But it's about two guys running through a forest away from a bear. And while they're running, the first guy stops and takes off his shoes and puts on another pair of shoes. And the second guy says, well, what are you doing? We'll be eaten by the bear if we're stopping now. And changing your shoes will not make a difference because you won't be outrunning the bear. And the first guy says, well, I don't really have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you. So, this is a really interesting story because it brings home a very important point that you don't really have to be the best runner. You just have to be really good in context of what's going on and be just ever so slightly better than someone else or the competition. So I think it's very important, and that's already been mentioned by Ben just now. It's not about having all the answers and being perfect in the data that you may have about users, but acknowledging that there is something to explore here, and to a degree also don't just look at what's probable based on the insights you have, but also look at what's possible. I think good design is informed in data and user insights, but good design also inspires imagination, and that should go beyond purely data and insight. So when presenting, knowing your audience is super useful. I don't always follow this structure. I find it super useful as a general framework. Obviously, if you know the people that you're presenting to, you may want to skip step one. You may also want to skip the gather feedback stage if there is a different format. But generally, this I found always super useful, and building up towards the design is something that I would like to see more. So there's just one more thing for me to say. Break a leg. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Flo. Fantastic talk and lots to think about there. I think we've got time for a few questions. So I'll kick off with one from James, which is, do you have any advice on when to present design work and how frequently you should present it? I mean, do you go for a big bang, or do you go for kind of more of a softly type of approach?
That's a really good question. I think it depends on your stakeholders, obviously, but I find it sometimes useful when stakeholders are guided through the process of what it requires. So sharing the process, I think, is more important than the design. So invite product owners or engineers into user testing sessions so that they can see what decisions are actually made based on that insight, rather than having them hover above your shoulder and say, well, move this up, move this down. So I think a low frequency and sharing the actual design is probably better, but a high frequency of involving them in the process is probably better as well. So whether that's workshops, whether that's user testing sessions. So I think the actual presentation of the design, a lower frequency is better.
Okay, that's great. I mean, that actually preempted a follow-on question to that, which is how much process do you show? Are you taking your, yeah, I suppose it depends on the context of the presentation, but how much process is good? I mean, what do people need to know?
Yeah, it's a good question too, because I think, you know, when you talk about the brief, when you talk about insights, at this point people will say, oh, hold on, actually this is not quite the right brief. You know, you can then ask them to give you a better brief, or you provide a really good framework for a better brief going forward. And also when you talk about insights and there is a lack of insights, then it also helps the stakeholders to understand the process that's required to actually get there more confidently. And I think also designers are essentially in the business of helping people elsewhere to make more confident decisions, whether that's engineers or people in marketing or product owners. I think, you know, that's one really important bit, I believe, that designers should be mindful of, that the decision making is what they're facilitating, and that can be, you know, very important sometimes.
Okay, brilliant. We have a question from Jason Meza. How do you deal with stakeholders that just want you to cut to the chase, or just can't hold all the context in mind to frame their feedback?
Yes, I've had that numerous times, where people say, okay, you know, I'm short in time here. I think really this is the question of, you know, the first point: know your audience. If you know that someone is like that, then you should really keep it really brief and cut to the chase quickly. But typically, you know, this is point number one: know your audience. If you know that they know very little and they're patient enough to, you know, especially when you're consulting, you're being paid a lot, they should give you 5 minutes or 10 minutes to outline the steps around, you know, why are you doing this, what are you trying to achieve, before you actually share the design. But yes, yeah, the impatient ones probably require a little bit less time in the beginning, or, you know, they just want to cut to the chase and then want to give you feedback right away. But yeah, knowing your audience, this is really where it all starts.
And relating to that, knowing your audience, do you ever find yourself in situations where you're surprised by who's in a meeting, that you're presenting to somebody who perhaps you didn't expect to be presenting to, especially in like larger, more complex organizations?
Yes, yeah, no, and this is, you know, this is dangerous, and this is why, you know, there are always elements of risk, you know, when presenting. You can't always make sure that you've talked to absolutely everyone. Let's imagine you've talked to 2 people, and then you know what they're expecting, and then you have 20 people in the room. But as long as you have, you know, done your preparation, I think in this moment you are so confident presenting that it will inspire the right response. You know, with the right presentation and with the right experience, the confidence really makes the other people in the room also feel confident about what you're doing.
Okay, that's great. And we have a question from Mo. Do you have any tips on how to convince people to build metrics into the service? Obviously, metrics are important, you know, in terms of sort of the culture change and getting them to embrace that more. Do you have any tips on that?
Yeah, I think this is a really difficult one, because culture change is incredibly hard. But also I think it requires stakeholders to understand that there is actually a level of objectivity that is part of the design process, right? And this is what user experience is pretty much mostly about, right? Bringing as much objective decision making into the process as possible. So I would really start from Adam and Eve and you know, try to explain to them what the process typically is, and that requires probably a little bit more hand holding. But also it's sometimes a budget question. Some people just don't have budget for expensive analytics tools that give insights into user behavior, or time for research, right? That's very unfortunate. But this is then where the design is slightly degraded into very subjective, let's make the logo bigger stuff, where you're just tapping in the dark and you think, well, I can do that, but this is not based on any insights. This is just based on opinions. And I guess it, at this point, all the effort should go into persuasion and hand holding and improving the steps, and then perhaps showing good examples of where this was working really well.
Okay, great. I think that's all the questions we've got at the moment. If anyone does have any more questions for Flo, feel free to ask them either in the YouTube chat or on Slack. I'm sure I'll be around to answer those. We'll have a break now for 15 minutes. We'll be starting again at 12 with Cat Husbands talking about imposter syndrome. So hope to see you all then.